Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. We are continuing our lessons from Luke's Gospel. We advance today to chapter 6, skipping chapters 4 and 5 and the early part of chapter 6. I do not have time to discuss, I said chapters 4 and 5, also chapter 3. We're skipping those chapters. Lots of material there. We don't have time to cover them and then cover today's lesson. So I'm going to try to confine my remarks to today's lesson. Now let me also preface the study from today's lesson by saying I've read from many different sources the ideas about today's lesson, and I am tremendously convicted of by today's lesson that I do not measure up to the standard Jesus set for all of us. We should all seek to be like Jesus. I submit we all fall short. Paul tells us we all fall short. So how do we deal with it? Well, let me illustrate perhaps with a report to you who have been faithful receivers of these Sunday school lessons through this medium from Colonial Hill. The last 2 weeks, we have experienced technical difficulties that actually prevented our presentations from going out or interrupted them partway through. We think we have those issues and problems resolved, but someone asked me, doesn't it upset you that you have studied and prepared and actually given, because we record all of our lessons, actually studied and prepared and then spent time to give the lesson and then it not be able to be presented? Doesn't that upset you? And the answer is, it doesn't upset me, it does frustrate me. But the follow-up question was, does that make you want to just quit? Now, there are many people who think I ought to just quit so we could get somebody else in here who could really do a good job instead of me. But the answer to that question is, I receive and get far more from the lesson preparation and presentation than I give. I get far more. And today's lesson is a great illustration of that. Today's lesson from chapter 6 in Luke's Gospel, some suggest is the most difficult commands or instructions given by Jesus in all of the New Testament. This is not the love your neighbor as yourself lesson. This is the love your enemy lesson. And it is that is extremely difficult to do. And I must step to the front of the line and say I am the biggest, or at least as big, a violator or failure to measure up to Jesus' standard with respect to this lesson as anyone on earth. And so I hope that this lesson doesn't come across preachy. It is instead a compilation of other commentaries that I have read and studied to try to understand. And by the way, the lesson is easy to understand what the words say and even what those words mean. But the application is the most difficult, and I fall far short. several of the, in fact, most of those sources that I study from also, shall I say, agreed or also came to the same conclusion that this is some of the most difficult instructions, the most difficult standard that Jesus set for us to live by. One even went so far as to say, and I think maybe to try to justify our inability to live up to this standard that Jesus sets in today's lesson by saying it is hyperbole, it is exaggeration stated for the purpose of making a point. And the point is that God loved us so much that he sent his son Jesus, who loved us so much that he endured everything for his purpose. His purpose is that we might have a bridge across the gap that our sins have caused in separating us from God. The problem is, I think to reach that conclusion that this is just hyperbole, just exaggeration to prove a point, comes close to saying God's words, Jesus' words, are not true, and we don't have to try to live by them fully. I think that is a greater problem than my failure to follow these commands. So let's look at this lesson today and see what Jesus' commands are that may be difficult to follow. Now let me say that let me look back and say let's go back to verse 17 of chapter 6. And we're talking about Jesus, and he has he's teaching his disciples, but also teaching those who have come from a long ways away to hear him preach, and hopefully to be healed by this miraculous healer, Jesus. And it says in verse 17, he went down with them and stood on a level place. What's important about that? This lesson, or chapter 6, has been called the Sermon on the Plains, that is the level place, as opposed to chapters 5, 6, and 7 out of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus is it's really a hill. It's called a mountain. I've been there. Great privilege to take a tour of Israel, the Holy Lands, the places where Jesus walked and taught. But that was the Sermon on the Mount. This is called the Sermon on the Plains because he went down out of the mount to a level place and began teaching. I thought that was interesting, and so I offer that for you. All right, let's look at today's lesson. We're looking at verses 27 through 38. They're not long, and so we ought to be able to cover it, except to try to figure out how we are to put into practice that which Jesus teaches. In verses 27 and 28, I'm reading from the New International Version, an older version of the New International Version. In red letters, thus Jesus is talking. Jesus says, "But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." Love your enemies. Extremely simple, easy to understand, but difficult to put into practice. But Jesus then goes on and doesn't make it any easier by telling us exactly how we are to love our enemies. We are to do good. We are to bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. First of all, Jesus is recognizing that we will have enemies. But this plan of God's kingdom takes into account, therefore, it takes into account real world problems. Though we will have enemies, yet we are to respond to them in love. And maybe the only way we can do that is to trust that God will protect our cause and defeat our enemies in the best way possible, by maybe then transforming them into friends. So what are we to do again? We are to do good. The love Jesus told us to have for our enemies, we're not talking about a warm, fuzzy feeling deep inside the heart. If we wait for that, we probably will never love those enemies. Instead, the love for our enemies is a love that does something for them. Love here is agape. It is an active word, not a feeling word. And so it is something we do or we act towards them rather than how we feel about them. Bless those who curse you, Jesus says, means that we are to speak well or think well or pray well for those, even those who are speaking ill of us at the time. And that means that we cannot love our enemies the same way we love those who are closest to us. That would be, Dr. Barclay said that would be unnatural, impossible, and even wrong. But we can see to it that no matter what a man does to us, even if he insults us or ill-treats us or even injures us, we will seek nothing but their, T-H-E-I-R, their highest good. Next couple of verses. If someone, now Jesus goes from the general now to the specific. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other. We have paraphrased that to say, turn the other cheek. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Wow. Turn the other cheek. Jesus continues with this most difficult teaching. He says, we must accept certain evils committed against us. When a person strikes us on one cheek, our natural inclination is to strike them back and to give them even more than they've inflicted on us. But Jesus says that we should patiently endure such insults and the offense of assault, and not resist an evil person who insults us in this way. Instead, we are to trust God to defend us. He talks about someone taking your cloak. Ancient Jewish writings, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the hitting on the cheek. And generally, it's a backhanded slap. It is a great insult. Ancient Jewish writings say that striking someone with the back of the hand is a severe insult, punishable by a heavy or strong fine. But It's wrong to think Jesus meant that evil should never be resisted. Jesus himself demonstrated with his life that evil should and must be resisted, such as when he turned over the tables of the money changers in the temple. Jesus, says Dr. Barclay, Jesus is here saying that the true Christian has learned to resent no insult and to seek retaliation for no slight. So when we think how Jesus himself was insulted and spoken against, I mean, he was called a glutton, a drunk, an illegitimate child, a blasphemer, and a madman, and so on and so forth. If we think how he was insulted, and yet we see how he lived this very principle himself, we see the standard that he is in fact trying to impose upon us, or he is setting out in front of us. But it's also wrong to think that Jesus meant that a physical attack cannot be resisted or defended against. When Jesus spoke of a slap on the cheek or a strike to the face, he is talking about, at least culturally at that time, he is talking about this deep insult and not really a physical attack. Jesus did not mean that if someone hits us on the right-hand side of our face with a baseball bat, that we should allow them to hit us again on the left-hand side of the head. That's not what he's saying. It's also wrong to think that Jesus meant that there is no place for punishment or retaliation in society. Jesus instead is speaking of a personal relationship, or our personal relationships, and he's not talking about the proper functions of government in restraining evil. Look at what Paul had to say in Romans chapter 13 about government and their responsibilities. Instead, Jesus is saying, turn the other cheek when personally insulted. But the government has a responsibility to restrain the evil man from physical assault. And so what about this taking our cloak and giving him the tunic instead? He's telling us how to treat people who mistreat us or coerce us or even steal from us. Our response should be a willingness to address or to respond in a sacrificial, giving, and love manner. Under Mosaic law, if we look to Exodus and Deuteronomy, chapters 22 and chapters 24 in particular, we see that it violated Mosaic law for somebody to take our outer cloak. But Jesus here is teaching that if they do, we should be willing to say, you may even need my, one translation says, shirt, and give it to them, the inner tunic. That might be an undershirt worn next against the body. But we can only practice this type of sacrificial love when we know that God will take care of us. I can only give that away. I can only follow this teaching and give away my inner shirt, if you will, more than what they've taken from me, more than what they've asked. If I am confident and trust in God himself that he will take care of us, that he will take care of me. He has more than one tunic that he can provide to me. It's an interesting examination of Jesus' teaching, and it is a teaching that I struggle with on a daily basis. or on a regular basis, maybe not daily. When approached by somebody who is a panhandler asking for money, my initial response is to resist or to say no. That's confession. I'm not proud of it. I start questioning the motives of the other person and what he or she is going to do with that money and whether or not they are truly panhandlers. And why should I give them the money that I have gone out and earned when they are not doing anything? I'm wrong according to the law that Jesus, or the standard that Jesus set out in front of me. And in being resistive, in essence, I'm saying, this is mine, and I don't really trust God to use me as an instrument to replace to me what I'm giving away. I'm wrong, and I'm not living according to Jesus' standards. Our next verse is the golden rule, and maybe best known of all that Jesus says in this passage. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Now, this is a positive statement of the golden rule. It is not, this idea really predates Jesus on earth. There was a negative way of stating it that's found in many old codes of law in other civilizations. Essentially, it says, you should not do to your neighbor what you would not want him to do to you. But that is the negative way. Jesus advances a new and more positive way of stating it when he says we should do unto others what we would have them do unto us. And so doing, Jesus is giving us a broader, better, and maybe even more difficult to way. It's the difference between the negative is don't break a traffic law, do not speed. And so if I'm not speeding, I can be found, and if I'm charged with speeding, I didn't speed, and therefore I can be found not guilty. But the positive is doing something positive, like helping a stranded motorist. And so if I'm charged with not living up to the positive standard, you did not help the stranded motorist, even though there is no law that says I should do so. There is a law that says I shouldn't speed. I'm not living up to the do unto others what you would have them do unto you. I'm guilty of not following the golden rule. And so, in the context especially of Christian relationships, if we would have someone else's love and have people reach out to us, then we must love and reach out to them. Dr. Spurgeon said, "Oh, that all men acted on it," talking about the golden rule, "and there would be no slavery, no war, no swearing, no striking, no lying, no robbing, but all would be justice and love. What a kingdom is this which has such a law." That makes it a little bit easier to understand this golden rule, but it really doesn't make it any easier to obey. No one really has ever done consistently unto others as they would have others do unto them. Let's look at the pattern of love that God lays out for us through Jesus' statements. Look at verses 32 through 35. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. So he comes back to that first teaching. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. I believe Jesus is teaching here that we have a different standard. Even sinners do good when they think they're going to get good back. They even assist others when they think that they might in turn get assistance back from others, even to the point of lending to others if they expect to get repayment. If your neighbor comes by and says, "Can I borrow your tool?" The Christian following Jesus' standard says, "Yes, here's my tool." Even if we know that that neighbor has a bad habit of failing to return what's been lent to him. That's between him and God. Between me and God, God sees me carrying out the act of love. And Jesus says, that's our chore, that's our task. So how can we do that? How can a Christian follow and obey this teaching? David Guzik in The Enduring Word on this subject says, Christians do in fact have something that others do not have. They are in fact renewed, repentant, and redeemed by Jesus Christ. And they have a power that others do not have. They can do all things through Christ who strengthens them. So that's how we can do some of these things. And in doing so, you will be sons of the Most High. In other words, this is how we imitate God, who shows love towards his enemies. And he is kind even to those who are unworthy by our judgment. But that then leads us to the rest of the teaching. Verses 36 through 38, Jesus wrote, "Be merciful just as your Father is merciful." And then he says, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." I want to call upon David Guzik's writings again for discussion of these verses. He says, "Among those who seem to know nothing of the Bible, this is the verse that seems to be the most popular. Do not judge. Yet most of the people who quote this verse don't understand what Jesus was saying. They seem to think or hope that Jesus commanded a universal acceptance of any lifestyle or teaching. But that is not what Jesus is teaching. Just a little bit later in this same Sermon on the Plains, verses 43 through 45, which is not a part of our lesson this morning, Jesus commanded us to know ourselves and others by the fruit of their life, and some sort of assessment is necessary for that. The Christian is called upon to show unconditional love, but the Christian is not called to unconditional approval. We really can love people who do things that should not be approved or approved of. When our judgment in regard to others is wrong, it is often not because we judge according to a standard, but because we are hypocritical in the application of that standard. We ignore the standard in our own life. It is common to judge others by one standard and ourselves by another or a different standard, and obviously being far more generous to ourselves than we are to others in applying the standard. According to some teaching, the teaching of some of the rabbis in Jesus' time, God had two measures he used to judge people. One was a measure of justice, and the other was a measure of mercy. And so the question is asked, which measure do you want God to use with you? And then you should use that same measure in applying the standards of Jesus to others as well. A most difficult teaching, but one that really struck home to me. And so I have tried to pray and identify my own enemies, prayed to identify for the good of my enemies, and tried to stop thinking of those that I don't like in a judgmental fashion. I was trying to see where in my notes I wrote something about Democrats say that Republicans are of a lower intelligence and a sorrier style of living. Republicans say that Democrats are elitist and socialist. Both are wrong to condemn their enemies, and as a result, we have a great problem in our country right now. Pray that our leaders will listen to or see and hear and try to apply today's lesson so that we don't denigrate one another. We love one another. And pray for goodness, even for our enemies. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. Won't you continue to worship with us here at Colonial Hill Baptist Church? We would love to see you in person. And when we can, we will worship with you. Thank you and good morning.